I want you to close your eyes for a second. Well, unless you're driving. If you're driving, please keep your eyes on the road.
Definitely keep them on the road.
Yeah. But for everyone else, I want you to picture this image. It's arguably one of the most famous illustrations in human history.
Oh, I think I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. So on the far left, you have a crouching knuckle-walking chimp. And then, moving to the right, you get a slightly taller, hairier ape man, then a Neanderthal carrying a spear. And finally, on the far right, standing tall, proud, usually holding a briefcase or, I don't know, a smartphone in the modern parodies, is a human being. The March of Progress. You know the one I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely. It's ubiquitous. I mean, it's on T-shirts, album covers, coffee mugs, episodes of The Simpsons. It is literally the defining visual shorthand for evolution. It's iconic.
Exactly. And here's the problem. That image is lying to you.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, it's telling you a story that has a lot less to do with biology and a whole lot more to do with 19th century British politics.
Which is such a wild pivot. And that is the hook of today's deep dive. We are looking at a really fascinating piece of analysis titled The Evolutionary Ladder, Biology Beyond Victorian Hierarchical Metaphor.
Right.
And our mission here is to totally dismantle that mental image of the ladder. You know, that deeply ingrained idea we all have that evolution is a linear climb from quote-unquote lower creatures to higher creatures.
This is one of those topics where I feel like we just have to unlearn something we totally absorbed in grade school. The source material makes this really big distinction right off the bat, which I loved.
Yeah, the mechanism versus the metaphor.
Exactly. It argues that there is the biological mechanism of evolution, like the actual nuts and bolts of what happens out there in nature. And then there were the cultural metaphors we used to talk about it. And apparently we have been missing them up for about 150 years.
We have. And honestly, it's a very easy mistake to make. Because the biological mechanism, natural selection, adaptation, genetic drift, is incredibly complex.
Oh, yeah.
It's messy. It is non-linear. So human beings, we use stories and metaphors to make sense of it. The problem arises when the metaphor starts to overwrite the actual science.
Right.
The real aha moment in this deep dive is realizing that the way we talk about evolution, using words like struggle, survival, advancement, that wasn't inevitable. It was borrowed directly from the specific culture Charles Darwin lived in.
So let's unpack that roadmap, because we are going to get into how Victorian society kind of hijacked biology. We'll talk about why survival of the fittest is mostly misunderstood, and what modern science actually says about progress.
Sounds like a plan.
Because I think most people assume that when Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, he was just, observing nature in a vacuum.
Right.
Just a guy on a boat looking at finches, recording data, purely objective.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
That's the scientific ideal we all strive for. But no scientist operates in a vacuum. The source material asks us to really set the scene of the Victorian era. You have to think about what was actually happening in England in the mid-19th century when this theory was hitting the presses.
Right. So visually we're talking top hats, steam engines, cobblestones. But structurally...
Structurally, we are looking at the absolute peak of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Think about the massive systems at play then. You have this sudden explosion of industrial capitalism. You have the British Empire expanding aggressively across the globe.
Taking over everything.
Exactly. And at home, you have a society that is obsessed, and I mean completely obsessed with class rank and social hierarchy.
It was a world defined by intense competition. Like if you weren't climbing, you were falling. There was no middle ground.
Precisely. It was a world where success literally meant climbing the social ladder. It was an environment built on competitive economic ideology. The dominant narrative was that if you worked hard and fought your way up, you were simply better.
Right.
So when people in that specific time and place looked at nature, they didn't just see birds and beetles acting randomly. They saw a reflection of their own society.
That is just wild to me. So you're saying they projected their own economic anxiety onto the animal kingdom?
In a very real way, yes. The source calls this the metaphorical bleed. When your entire world is structured around rank, distinct classes, and this idea that you have to aggressively fight your way to the top to matter, you inevitably start describing nature in those exact same terms.
Oh.
You look at a predator and prey, and you don't just see a basic calorie exchange. You see a class struggle. You see a winner and a loser.
And that's where we get those specific keywords the source mentions. Struggle, competition, survival, advancement. I mean, when you think about it, those aren't necessarily biological terms, they're economic ones.
That's the core distortion right there. Darwin was describing a mechanism of differential survival.
Which means what exactly?
Basically just that some things survive and reproduce better in a specific environment than others. That's a statistical reality.
Hmm.
But the culture, reading his work, they heard struggle for dominance. They heard the best rise to the top.
So the latter wasn't actually in the biology.
Exactly. The latter was in the culture looking at the biology.
Which brings us to something that honestly blew my mind when I was reading through the notes. Survival of the fittest. I mean, that is the catchphrase of evolution. That is the bumper sticker. But the source says Darwin didn't actually come up with it.
No, he did not. That phrase was actually popularized by Herbert Spencer.
Herbert Spencer. Okay, give us the dossier on him, because he sounds like he has a lot to answer for here.
He really does. So Herbert Spencer was a philosopher and a sociologist, and he was writing around the exact same time as Darwin. And Spencer was a massive proponent of laissez-faire capitalism.
Ah, that explains a lot.
Right. And this distinction matters immensely. Survival of the fittest is a very loaded phrase compared to what Darwin was actually trying to say.
It sounds like a gladiator match. 2 enter, 1 leaves.
It totally does. It implies a winner and a loser in a distinctly moral sense. Fittest suggests best. It suggests that if you survived, you deserve to survive because you were objectively superior to whatever died out. It validates the outcome as being right.
Whereas Darwin's actual idea was more like survival of the good enough for right now.
Exactly. Survival of the fitting. It's about fitting into a context, like how a key fits a lock.
Oh, I like that.
It's not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most complex key. It's just about fitting the immediate lock you're faced with. But Spencer's phrasing reinforced that ranking system. And here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly a little dark. This metaphorical framing fed right back into political and economic ideologies.
You mean social Darwinism?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is the ultimate danger of the feedback loop the source warns us about. You take a cultural idea like competition is good, you project it onto nature saying nature is a competitive ladder.
Right.
And then you turn around and use that quote-unquote natural fact to justify your culture. You say society should be a ruthless competitive ladder because, hey, that's just how nature works. It becomes a justification framework for social stratification.
That is terrifyingly circular. It's literally like saying the rich are rich because they're quote-unquote fitter, just like the lion is king of the jungle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It completely strips the scientific theory of its neutrality. It turns descriptive biology, which just says things change over time, into normative hierarchy, which says things get better and the people at the top are there because they are naturally superior.
Wow.
It allowed Victorians to look at the poor or look at colonized subjects around the world and say, well, it's tragic, but it's just nature taking its course.
It's just science. I mean, that is a very convenient excuse for an empire.
Very convenient.
So we have this Victorian hangover where we instinctively think of evolution as a ladder of progress, but the source is titled Biology Beyond Victorian Hierarchical Metaphor. So if we actually take away the ladder, what is there? What does modern science say evolution actually looks like?
Well, if you take away the ladder, you're left with a bush or a web or maybe a sprawling, chaotic river delta.
A bush. Okay, well, that is not as catchy as a ladder, I'll admit. But walk me through the mechanics of the bush.
The source lists the key mechanisms of modern evolutionary theory. You've got adaptation to environmental conditions, branching diversification, and niche specialization.
Niche specialization. That sounds a lot less like conquering the world and more like, I don't know, finding your lane.
That's a perfect way to put it. Finding your lane.
Yeah.
Evolution has no intrinsic upward direction.
None.
None at all. And this is the hardest thing for us to wrap our heads around because we are so heavily conditioned to think in terms of progress. We want a narrative arc. We want a hero's journey. But biology doesn't move from lower to higher. It just moves from ancestral to derived.
But wait, surely we are higher than, say, a slime mold.
Right.
I mean, I can do a dig dive. I can drive a car. A slime mold just kind of slimes around. Doesn't complexity count as being higher on the scale?
That is the intuitive trap we all fall into. But you have to ask yourself, is complexity the exact same thing as success?
I mean, I want to say yes, because we really value complexity. We like our smartphones better than telegraphs.
Right, but biology doesn't care about smartphones. Biology only cares about reproduction and persistence, getting your genes into the next generation. The source uses a really great example here, bacteria.
Okay.
We tend to think of bacteria as primitive or lower organisms because they are simple, single-celled, and incredibly ancient. But bacteria are wildly successful. They are arguably the most successful life form on Earth
Because there's so many of them.
because of their sheer adaptability. They adapt to almost every environment imaginable, from boiling thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean to the inside of your stomach. They make up a huge percentage of the total biomass of the planet.
So in the actual game of survival, they are winning just as much as we are, maybe even more considering how fragile humans actually are.
Exactly. In many environments, being complex is actually a massive disadvantage. Think about it. It takes a massive amount of energy to run a human brain and a complex mammalian body. If you're in a resource-scarce environment, simplicity is better. It is more adaptive. If a giant meteor hits and wipes out the food supply, the complex organisms die first. The bacteria survive.
Oh, wow.
So bacteria aren't inferior to mammals, they just represent a different, highly effective strategy for staying alive.
That really flips the script. We usually think, oh, evolution started with goo, then got better and better until it finally made me. But really, evolution is just reorganization.
It's contextual adaptation. It is a dynamic, ongoing reorganization process. Sometimes that means getting more complex. Sometimes it actually means getting simpler.
Like going backward.
Well, we see it as backward.
Yeah.
There are parasites that used to have eyes and limbs in their evolutionary history, and they lost them because they just didn't need them once they started living inside a host. They devolved in our cultural view, but biologically they optimized. They stopped wasting energy on eyes in the dark.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
It's not a climb to the top. It's a lateral move to stay in the game as the rules change.
A lateral move to stay in the game? I love that phrasing. It really makes you realize how arrogant the ladder metaphor really is. It's pure ego. It places us right at the absolute pinnacle of everything.
It is pure anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
And the source dives deep into the philosophical danger of that kind of ego. When we use the ladder metaphor, we are constantly conflating differentiation with superiority.
Meaning what exactly? That being different just means...
It means just that. Things become different over time. Divergence happens. That is a biological fact. But the ladder metaphor takes that and turns different into better. It essentially converts a descriptive fact into a value judgment.
And that's where things get dangerous.
Extremely dangerous. Because once you accept the premise that nature is a hierarchy of value, that a human is literally worth more than a chimp, which is worth more than a fish, it becomes very easy to accept that human society should be a hierarchy of value too.
Right. Like we said before, it's only natural. That becomes the ultimate excuse for inequality.
Precisely. If nature is a strict hierarchy, then human hierarchy feels inevitable. It feels mandated by the universe. But if nature is actually just a vast network of diverse strategies where nothing is inherently better, just different, well, then that entire justification for social inequality just completely starts to crumble.
See, this is why I love these deep dives. We start out talking about biology and chimpanzees, and we end up talking about philosophy and how we structure our entire society.
It's all connected.
It really is. But I do want to pivot back to the science for a second. Because the Victorians were a long time ago. Darwin wrote Origin of Species in 1859. Science hasn't just stood still since then. We've mapped the genome. We know about DNA. We must have updated them.
Oh, absolutely. We have corrected the record in a lot of significant ways.
Because the source mentions that we have moved well past that pure competition model. Like if you listen to the Spencer types, nature's just a constant bloodbath. But clearly, looking out the window, that's not the whole picture.
We have moved way past it. And this is where the story gets really hopeful, at least in my opinion. Later developments in biology have seriously challenged that obsession with constant struggle. The source highlights a few key figures who saw exactly what the Victorians missed. One of the big ones is Peter Kropotkin.
Kropotkin, he was the Russian prince who became an anarchist, right? I mean, talk about a career pivot.
The very same. But alongside his politics, he was also a highly respected, serious naturalist. And here is the fascinating contrast. While the British naturalists were doing their fieldwork looking at tropical jungles, which are densely packed, teeming with life, super competitive,
Right.
Kropotkin was doing his primary research in Siberia.
Oh, a totally different environment.
Completely different. It's harsh, it's freezing cold, it's largely empty. And while the British saw animals fighting each other for limited resources, Kropotkin saw animals fighting the elements.
Just trying to survive the winter.
Yes. And what he observed was that in those extreme conditions, the animals that competed with each other ended up dead. The animals that cooperated, the ones that huddled together for warmth, that shared food, that hunted in synchronized packs, they were the ones that survived.
Wow. So he wrote Mutual Aid.
Yes, mutual aid.
Yeah.
Factor of evolution. He argued powerfully that cooperation is just as much a driver of evolutionary success as competition is. It was this massive, necessary counterbalance to the whole gladiator narrative.
So cooperation isn't just some nice-to-have moral bonus. It's a literal survival strategy.
Absolutely, it is biologically selected for. And then, much later in the 20th century, you have another giant leap with Lynn Margulis. She completely revolutionized our understanding of cells with something called endosymbiotic theory.
Endosymbiotic theory. Okay, that's a mouthful. Break that down for us. Because this is the idea that complex cells actually came from simple cells eating each other, right?
Essentially, yes, but not just eating integrating. Before Margulis came along, the standard assumption was that evolution was always this slow, gradual accumulation of tiny competitive changes. Competition, competition,
Yeah.
competition.
Right.
But Margulis looked at the complex cells that make up you and me, eukaryotic cells, and she said, hey, look at the mitochondria in our cells, the parts that actually generate our energy. They look suspiciously like independent bacteria.
Because they have their own DNA.
They
Yeah.
do. They have their own distinct DNA.
Hmm.
And her theory, which, by the way, was totally laughed at initially by the scientific establishment, but is now universally accepted standard science,
Hmm.
was that billions of years ago, a big single-celled organism swallowed a smaller bacterium.
But didn't digest it.
Right. Instead of digesting it, they formed a permanent partnership.
Right.
The little one provided a massive new energy source, and the big one provided a safe, protected environment.
Symbiosis.
Exactly. She showed that the major leaps in biological complexity didn't come from winning a bloody fight. They came from a merger. They came from distinct organisms deciding they were better off living together. It's all about networking and integration.
That is amazing. So instead of a gladiator fight, it's more like a corporate merger or like a commune.
A deeply cooperative network. Today, biologists use network models and systems-based models to understand evolution. We clearly see now that integration and differentiation are just two different strategies. Neither one is inherently superior to the other. They're just distinct tools for survival.
It seems like we're finally moving from a line model to a web model.
That is the perfect visualization for it.
Yeah.
We went from a Victorian ladder of progress, which is linear, rigid, hierarchical, to a modern web of adaptation, which is interconnected, fluid, and entirely contextual. In a web, there is no top.
There's no pinnacle to reach.
Exactly. They're just nodes. Some nodes might be bigger, some might be smaller, but they're all connected, and they all fundamentally rely on the integrity of the whole web to survive.
So what does this all mean for us, like for the listener tuning in right now? Because obviously we're not Victorian industrialists in top hats, but I feel like we still carry that ladder around in our heads every single day. I definitely still feel that intense pressure to climb.
We all do. We see it everywhere in how we talk about our careers, our economies, even our personal growth. And what here is really about clarity of thought. Distinguishing between the mechanism, what actually happens out there in nature,
Yeah.
and the metaphor, the story we tell ourselves about it, is absolutely crucial for how we live.
Because if we don't separate them, we start thinking that life is supposed to be this constant, exhausting climb. And if we aren't climbing, we're failing.
Exactly. If you deeply believe the latter metaphor, then stagnation is equivalent to death. But if you look at the actual biology, stasis, just staying the exact same because it works perfectly well for your environment, is a completely valid, highly successful strategy.
Right? The sharks figured it out millions of years ago and just stayed sharks.
Exactly. Yeah. Evolution isn't a story of ascent. It's a story of fitting in. If you can stop seeing life as a ladder you constantly have to climb and start seeing it as a web you have to navigate, it totally changes how you see success. It changes how you view your relationship to other living things. We aren't the CEO of nature. We're just another node in the network.
And that is a profoundly humbling thought, but also kind of relieving, like I don't have to win evolution, I just have to fit.
You just have to adapt. And sometimes adapting means slowing down, cooperating with your neighbors, or even simplifying your life.
I love that. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave the listener with something to chew on. We've bashed the Victorians pretty hard today for projecting their specific culture onto objective science. They looked at a forest and basically saw a factory. But we aren't immune to that, are we? We're not these perfectly objective, enlightened observers now.
Oh, no, we certainly are not. We are creatures of our time just as much as Darwin was of his. That actually brings me to the provocative thought I'd like to end on today.
Let's hear it.
If the ladder of evolution was essentially just a reflection of Victorian industrial capitalism, what current cultural metaphors are we mistakenly projecting onto science today?
Oh, man, that is a good question. because we are obsessed with entirely different things now.
Think about the language we use every day.
Yeah.
We talk about the human brain as a computer. We talk about neuronal circuits. We talk about our DNA as code or software that can eventually be hacked. We even talk about natural ecosystems in terms of services and economic value.
Ecosystem services. That sounds very corporate.
It does.
Mhm.
So you have to ask, are these actually accurate biological descriptions? Or are we just projecting our own modern obsession with information technology and the digital economy onto nature, exactly like the Victorians projected their class systems?
Are we literally just seeing nature as a giant motherboard because that's the world we happen to live in right now?
It's a question really worth asking yourself. Is the brain actually a computer? Or is it just the most complex machine we happen to have invented right now, so we use it as a convenient metaphor? Every single generation thinks they finally see nature clearly, but we are always looking through our own cultural glasses.
Well, that is going to keep me up tonight. The idea that our perfectly objective science might just be our current culture wearing a lab coat. Thank you for that. And thank you to everyone listening for taking this deep dive with us today.
See the web, not the ladder.
Exactly. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.